I was working. I was out of high school. I was learning a trade, a building trade. I was a lather in a building trade. I was an apprentice. I was drafted into the Army. They sent me a notice and said, you have to come down for a physical at such and such a time. And I went down and I passed the physical and they drafted me into the United States Army.
Oh yes, everybody, the war started in 1950 and I was a junior in high school and it ended in 1953. So every fella that did not go to college was drafted unless he had some physical problem that he couldn't be drafted. Now the interesting thing, you could also be a conscientious objector, which would mean that you don't believe in wars. And you had to sort of prove that. But there was one fella in Wilkinsburg who was a conscientious objector. And everybody in town knew him. And most people did not speak to him when he wouldn't go to war. Mostly because everybody's brother, boyfriends, I didn't have a boyfriend that went to war, but all of my friends' boyfriends went. And it was a very patriotic thing to be drafted. I actually wrote letters to a couple fellas that had graduated ahead of me and contacted me and asked me to keep them up to date on what was going on in town. But I didn't feel that it was wrong to fight, but it was very definitely a war as opposed to what is going on now. They went in it to win it.
Well, I had 6 weeks of infantry training, and then I had 6 weeks of combat engineer training because that's the branch they were putting me in the Army. And then I had like about 2 months of leadership training, all at Fort Belvoir in Virginia. I went to, after I did all the training, combat engineer, infantry, and so for leaders course. After I did all that training, they called me and said, okay, now here, Rutherford, you're going to go to Korea, and you have to report to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey on such and such a date. And when I reported there, they took my number and stuff, and put me on a boat and sent me to Korea from Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. So I enjoyed that because I was a musician, not a very good musician, but I played a string bass, and we had a combo on board ship, and we used to play dances every night, and that was a special treat because I had a chow line pass and I didn't get any other duties on the boat. I just played the string bass and had a good time. And it took us 6 weeks, 7 weeks to get to Japan. We stopped at Panama, and then we stopped at Hawaii, and then we landed in Japan. And from Japan is when they sent me to Korea. Korea was terrible. There was nothing there. It was all dirt roads. There was the first city I saw in Korea was Seoul, and it wasn't really much of a city. It was all dirt roads and army everywhere. Now, all the armies in the UN were in Korea fighting that war. Yeah. It wasn't just American Army. Right. And it was terrible. There was nothing there. People were living in shacks they made out of cardboard boxes and pieces of tin, whatever they could find to build a house with. That's what they made a shelter with.
So what was your job?
My job, once I got to Korea, they sent me to a what we call artillery battalion. My first day at the artillery battalion, they called me in for an interview to see what kind of job that they could get me to do in the artillery. And I asked the colonel, who was the boss, if there was some kind of job I could do with where I wouldn't be around the guns. So I said, yeah, I have just the job for you, Rodriguez. So next thing I know, I was on the 38th parallel. The parallel is a latitude line. And 38th parallel was the line that said, hey, North Korea, you stay on that side of the line. South Korea, you stay on that side of the line. There won't be any shooting. So it was kind of a fake truce. They wanted to see if it would work. But I was right there on the line. And my job in the artillery was to get on the radio. I lived in an OP. OP Item Dog was the name of the OP I lived on. There were 4 GIs, and I watched the enemy, watched what they were doing over there, and if they were building an OP or digging a trench or whatever they were doing, we'd write it down and send it back into headquarters. The ROP was only as big as this room here, and then we had this slit watching, you know, you could look out and see the enemy, and we had these very powerful telescope type things. They called them BC scopes, and that's what we watched the enemy with, and that's how we figured out where they were over there, and we would call back to battalion where they were and what they were doing.
Yeah.
Just being away from home, the hardest part. Actually, the hardest part for some of the people before I got there was when they were shooting at each other, was when the American soldiers did not have winter clothing and it was cold. It got cold in Korea. It got like Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, in case you didn't know it, is on about the 40th degree latitude. And where I was in Korea was the 38th degree latitude. So you can see there wasn't much difference, maybe 50 or 60 miles north or south of where we are here. The North Koreans and Chinese came down and invaded South Korea and was taking their land and their property and their everything that the South Koreans had. The North Koreans and the Chinese were taken away from them. So, yeah, and of course the United States wouldn't stand for that, so that's how we happened to get involved in the war, and many other countries joined us. One time, I could tell you about the turkey story.
Yeah, tell us.
Yeah, the Boonson was the guy's name. He had 3 stars on his shoulder. It was like 3 stars were like a general has 3 stars, but he was in a Thai army. He wasn't in the American army. But anyway, he was my friend, and we'd talk, and he'd ask me this about the U.S. and that. But anyway, I said, well, boots on. I said, in a couple of weeks it'll be Thanksgiving at home. And he says, well, what is Thanksgiving? And I said, well, boots on, I don't know how to explain it. I said, but maybe a little bit, it was a big holiday, a little bit like Christmas. But at home on Thanksgiving, everybody eats turkey. So the next thing you know, about a week before Thanksgiving, 4 Thais came up the hill. We call them Thais because that's what they were, Thailanders. 4 Thais come up the hill, and they had a 20-pound frozen turkey and 12 dozen eggs for us GIs, us 4 GIs that were in the OP. And we didn't have a stove or an oven or anything like that. So, but we did have a little heater about this big, about a foot, maybe a foot and a foot and a half, and it burnt gasoline. And we would use our steel pots, our helmets. We'd take that and fill it up with water and put it on this little heater. and it wouldn't boil the water, but it would simmer. And actually what we did was we let the turkey thaw, and we pulled it apart with our hands. We didn't have any button knives, butcher knives or anything like that. We pulled it apart, pulled the legs off, pulled the wings off, and we ended up with 2 steel pots on this little burner, and we cooked it for 3 days. We let it simmer for 3 days, and it was so good. It was just the most moist and well done turkey that any of the 4 of us GIs ever had. But one of my friends came up from Seoul, 50 miles away, to join us in our Thanksgiving dinner. It was, in fact, I took advantage of the Army because I learned a lot of things that I wouldn't have learned otherwise. And I enjoyed most of it. Some of the people hated it. They hated being drafted. That was the worst thing that could happen to them. But I never felt that way. In fact, I'm still reaping benefits of having been in the Army back in 1950. I have hearing aids that I wear that the United States Army has given me because I belong to the Veterans Hospital in Butler. And this is the 3rd set of hearing aids, and one of the benefits is they cost about $7,000 a pair.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't have to pay for them. We bought our first house because I was in the Army. I went to school because I was in the Army. They helped us. They helped your grandpa go to Duquesne and St. Vincent's and University of Pittsburgh because I was in the Army. They gave me a stipend, not much money, but enough that we were able to get through.
It's a very modern country now.
Oh yeah, it's beautiful.
It's a beautiful place.
Looks like New York City or Chicago, but back in, no.
So there was a big benefit from
For that.
the
Oh
war
yeah.
because they were able to rebuild and
One other thing, Nana said we won the war. I don't know if we won the war or not. I don't remember anybody ever saying, well, I surrendered. Well, I never had to kill anybody. No one ever shot at me that I know of. So maybe that's why I liked it. That's all.